Good morning, everybody, officially. And let me get my mic on. That's right. Mike has the mic on. And since we've been talking about 2 Timothy, go ahead and turn to 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9. And this is going to be the introduction into what we're going to be talking about. 2 Timothy 1:9. There's a couple verses we're going to look before we dive into the topic at hand. So 2 Timothy 1:9, it states, "Who saved us and called us to a holy calling, not because of our works, but because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ Jesus before the ages began." I'm going to shut this thing. When you don't have carpet, it just all echoes, doesn't it? It's on. And so, the key that I want to bring up, see, that's what we should have done. We shut the door and everybody comes in. This is perfect. I love it. All right, so you guys just coming in, we're in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9, and this is not going to be a repeat of 2 Timothy study, but it is a talk of an introduction into our actual class today. And so, 2 Timothy 1:9, that last part says, which he gave us in Christ Jesus before the ages began. So this is something, his own purpose before the ages began. Now, if you look over in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4, there's a couple verses in Ephesians I want to look at. So there is a plan before the age began. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4, it says, "Even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him." So there is a plan before the time began. And in chapter 2 of Ephesians, verse 10, and there's a lot of verses that talk about this. We're just talking about these three. It says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Jesus Christ for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." So before the time began, before age began, this was a plan that was put in motion. And that plan, everything has a start. And so the start would be going back to Genesis chapter 3. So everything has a start. We know that this thing took place. The plan was before the time began. But in chapter 3, I know we've talked about this many times, about Adam and Eve. And so we've had a couple classes on it. We've preached on it. We've done these different things. So I'm not going to dive into it too much. But looking at this would be the fall. This would be the part that ends up causing all the problems. If you look over in verse 1, he says you're supposed to, chapter 1, verse 28, he says, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth." There's another command in Genesis 2:15, and it says that they're supposed to tend or take care or keep the garden. So that's a second command they're supposed to do. And then chapter 2, verse 17, just two verses down, he says there's two things they're supposed to do and one thing they're not supposed to do. Verse 17 says, "Do not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil." So multiply, take care of the garden, and don't eat from this tree. Those are the things that are supposed to take place. And as we know, the woman looks good for fruit. She takes a bite. She sends it to Adam. He's right there standing the whole time listening to the conversation and goes along right with it. And so when we talk about one being at fault, no, both of them. Both of them were at fault. That's the reason why God does what he does. There's punishment for the man, punishment for the woman, and there's going to be punishment for the serpent. And so in chapter 3, verse 15, this is where the gauntlet comes down because Satan drew first blood. Satan goes after God's creation. He goes after the ones that were created in the image of God. And so God, knowing beforehand what was going to take place, has already got a plan. And that's the amazing thing. Have you ever been around a business person that anytime, or just a boss, anytime something goes wrong, they've already got, oh yeah, we'll just do this. And they already know what's going to happen. It's kind of like, I remember eating, my granddad sending me out to eat, to go pick up, not to eat, go pick up some blackberries. Well, he knew what I was going to do, but he knew there's plenty out there for me to eat and bring in. And so God knows exactly what's going to take place and what's going to happen. He's got a plan for everything that we could even possibly do. So in chapter 3, verse 15, Satan's part, the serpent here, he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your heel, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Some say you'll strike his heel and he'll crush your head. And so that's exactly, he's told the serpent exactly how this is going to play out. You can fight, you can do all these things, but this is how it's going to happen. You're going to lose. And so this is the theme right here of the whole Bible. If you were to highlight, mark it, or whatever, this would be the theme. But the plan starts in motion in chapter 12. And then we're going to start looking at how this plan is fulfilled and all the different things God does. And I believe that Satan puts in God's way to try to foil that plan because he knows that he's going to lose in the end. And so in chapter 12, Abraham, he's mentioned throughout the Bible. He's mentioned, I forgot how many times that his name comes up, but it's often. And this man right here, he's told to go to a different place from where his fathers were. And in chapter 12, verse 1, it says, and now the Lord said to Abram, not Abraham yet, Abram, go to your country and to your kindred and to your father's house, to a land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I'll bless you, and I'll make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And so looking at that right there, we have the promise, and it's going to be told over and over again as we look through. And so we're going to take a look and see how many times he promises, he keeps his promises, but how many times he does this, and exactly how it is taken care of. But right here, we see Abraham's given the promise of the land, the nation, and the blessing. And so from that point, this would be the outline of the entire Bible. Because that land, we know they're going to get to the promised land. And that nation that's going to eventually be Israel. And then that blessing is going to eventually be Jesus, who the whole world will be blessed from. And this was the plan that was set up before time began. And so this is an amazing thing to me. Because you look at what he sets up. He finds a man. And every time you look, as we look through this study, God is looking for someone to use. He's found someone in Abraham. And so he is looking for someone to use. And then he's going to find someone else. In other words, he's looking to use us if we'd be pliable and be usable. And so here, we're going to see, as this goes through, all these different things that take place. Because sin in chapter 3 has caused guilt, it's caused shame, it's caused fear, separation, and it's caused death. And so Jesus, or God, through Jesus, is about to solve all that problem. And the amazing thing as we go through, we're going to look and see how all the Bible fits together. I think sometimes we can look at a book and different things, but we're going to try to see it all pieced together and how it all has one common theme all the way through. God wins. And this is how he's going to win. And he's given us the outline of how it's going to happen. He's going to create a nation. He's going to give that nation a land. And then from that land, there's going to be a lineage all the way through that can't be stopped no matter what comes up. And we're going to see things that come up. And that should give you encouragement, because that should tell you no matter what happens in your life, God's going to be in control, and God is going to protect, because he always knows how to rescue. He is the great rescuer of rescuers. He always knows how to deliver, and he delivers at the right time. And so we're going to see this as this plays out. So, looking at this, chapter 13. And if you have something to say, please speak up at any time. But we're going to be going through this So sometimes if I'm looking down, just let me know. Anybody have a comment? Anybody? No, go ahead, Julie. Mm-hmm.
Also, I lost my treasured Bible that it's been a process.
Yeah.
I ordered this and it got here early, but I just found it interesting that the first thing I got to mark was what you just said about concrete. That whole very first thing I got to put in.
There you go.
And then it was 12
Very good. Yeah. And the thing about that is, and what's neat about you using that, because she's going to give that to her granddaughter at some point, right? That's the plan. Yeah, but that's the plan, right? And so it's going to be all of her thoughts and all of her things in that Bible. What a cherished gift to be able to have those things to where you can pass down what my grandma was thinking through her studies. That's a wealth of information. And so she's going to be going through that in perfect timing because we're going to be going through the Bible. And so there'll be some things that you might have had marked that you'll say, oh yeah, I had that marked as we go through it. And you want to go ahead and knock that out. So no, that's really good. And I do want to check that Bible out. It's the Thompson Chain reference in the ESV. That's a new one. They quit making the NIV and they just have the New American Standard. I think they may have done away with that one, but they have the King James, the New King James, I believe American Standard, and now the ESV in that format. And it's a really good format. If you're wanting to really dive into study, that's probably the best study Bible out there because it doesn't give you commentary. It just tells you the verses and you put it all together. So look in chapter 13. So as this plan starts being laid out, it's going to take a while for this thing to lay out. And we're going to see some things as we go, but looking in chapter 13, look in verse 14. Now, what has just taken place is Lot has decided which way Lot's decided which way he's going to go. And so at that point, Lot chose the best place. I mean, he chose the lush area, and it was great. There's only one problem. Verse 13 says, now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. And that's the area that Lot chose. And we could get a lesson out of that. When we choose just based off the external, sometimes we're going to be in trouble. He should have looked a little bit deeper into that situation and chose something different. Because you can only imagine it's the great land, and then Abram's just sitting there thinking, really? Man, I told him I'm separating. You take that, I'll go the other way. And this other way isn't too good. And so here at that point, he's got to be thinking something. And the Lord in verse 14, Lord said to Abram, after Lot is separated from him, lift up your eyes and look for the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land, and here we have the land promise reminded, all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I'll make you the offspring as the dust on the earth, so that no one can count the dust of the earth. Your offspring also can be counted. So he's saying if anyone can count that, then you could count your offspring. It's going to be too much for you to count. So he's then reminded him of the land blessing or land promise and the nation promise. And so what's interesting as we go through this will be another study that we'll take a look at some point. But one thing that he does in verse 18, what does he build? He builds an altar. And you're going to see that the people of the Old Testament did things a little bit different. They build an altar. They name it something after the experience they had or after the character they've seen in God. And so you can get a lot of understanding of who God is by looking at the things that they built. We see later on, right now, Abram does not have a child. And his wife, Sarai, is going to say, hey, take my maidservant. And he's going to say, okay. So Hagar and him are going to end up having a child named Ishmael. And Sarai is going to be mean to her. Imagine that. I mean, it's your idea. And so she takes off. And God ends up providing for that person because they're out, she's like, me and my son are going to die. We're going to perish. And God provides. And so she names that area the Lord who provides for me. And so we can get a lot of ideas of who God is because he does the same thing for us. He provides for us daily. The sun came up. We've had rain in the past. We've got sunshine now. I mean, he always provides for us. And so that'll be a study for another time. But here at this time, he's been reminded there's going to be a land and there's going to be a nation. And then he ends up having to rescue Lot. And then in chapter 15, if you go over there, it's amazing. In verse 15, he says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision and said, fear not, Abram. I keep wanting to say Abraham. It says, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. And then as he goes up, look up in verse 4, it says, behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And this is where he was going to have his servant be his heir. And in verse 5, here we go with some promises. He brought him outside and said, look up toward heaven. So look toward heaven and number the stars if you're able to number them. He said to him, so shall your offspring be. He's said it's going to be like sand. Now it's going to be like stars. So we got the nation promise reminded. And in verse 6 he says, he believed the Lord and it counted to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans. I give you this land to possess. So he's reminded him of once more of that. Now, if you look in verse 13, he says his offspring, he's talking about it like it's already going to happen. Like it's a foregone conclusion you're going to have offspring. He doesn't even have a child yet. But God's talking because God's in charge. He's like, well, this is what's going to happen. Your ancestors are going to go and they're going to go into this place and they're going to be there. And how many years does it say there in verse 13? 400 years. Now it's interesting because when we get to Exodus, it's going to say 430 years to the date they walked out. Now it's going to say 430. And here it says 400. And how do you figure that? Well, how we can figure that out is he was promised these things when he was 75. He's not going to have a kid until he's 100. Well, there's 25 years, right? And from my understanding of the history, they would stay weaned on their mom for a good period of time, not like today. And so that historians say this was the time when that promise was made until when Isaac was weaned. So you would count that as part of the time because God counts it. Apparently, he's got a number there, 430 years to the date. So there's something to that because it reminds you again in Galatians that 430 years to the day. So here we have, this is going to take place. Now this is interesting here because he mentions 430. Then he goes on and says, afterward, you'll take great possessions. And we're going to talk about how that is fulfilled. And then he says, you're going to be buried in a good old age. And then look in verse 16. How many generations before they come back to this land? 4 generations, right? So look over to Exodus 6. In Exodus 6:16, in verse 16, it mentions these are the sons of Levi. And then we know the lineage as it goes down. In verse 18, you have Kotha in verse 18. And then in 20, you have Amram. And then in 20 still, you have Moses. You have 4 generations there. And so he's saying these things are going to take place. Now, it's 4 generations from the time that Moses, or the time Jacob is going to come to the scene. So he says, now this is also interesting in verse 16. He says, they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, I find that to be interesting too, because he already knows these people are doing bad. Doesn't it remind you of what Jonah did when he went to Nineveh? And he said, these people are going to be destroyed unless they repent. But he gave them opportunity to repent, didn't he? And so he's going to give opportunity to repent. And so he's going to allow them all this time, 400 years of time for this to take place. So looking at that, they're going to go away to Egypt. And then when in Egypt, there's going to be 4 generations and they're going to be coming back. Now, he mentions all that, and I can't help but think what it talks about in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. It says, God's patient. That means he's patient with all of us, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. Does that sound like the same character that he had in the Old Testament as he does in the New Testament? It does, doesn't it? He's given these Amorites opportunity, just like he's given us. In our lifetime, we have the opportunity, and theirs they did. And so that's got to be a comfort, because some people say there's a different God in the old than the new. And you can see that it's one and the same. He still means what he says, but he gives you opportunity. Edward?
I'm glad you brought up that point, because I've heard it many times said that he was a God of terror in the Old Testament and a God of love in the New Testament.
Yeah. And that would be completely opposite. I would say he's a God of justice in the Old Testament, and he's a God of justice in the New Testament. He's a God of grace in the Old Testament. He's a God of grace in the New Testament, because you think about how many times they messed around in the land, wandering around the desert before they got to the promised land. You have one of the things which kind of interesting. You have there when Moses is going up to get the 10 Commandments, you have what all the symbolism of what would take place in a wedding. And at some point we'll get into that. You have all these things that are taking place. You have a canopy, because he had a coverage. You have all these different things going on. Kind of like a wedding ceremony. God's saying, you're mine. And what do they do? Before he even comes down, he hears a noise, right? And what are they doing? They're dancing around, and apparently they're having sexual things taking place as well around this golden calf that apparently Aaron said people threw gold in and it popped up. And we know that wasn't right. And so during a spiritual wedding feast, a spiritual wedding ceremony, they're committing spiritual adultery. And what does God do? Does he kill them all? No, he wanted to, but he decided not to. He's got grace, doesn't he? He gives us an opportunity. He gave them an opportunity to get it right. And they kept getting it wrong. They had a miracle every day, right? A miracle every day with having manna fall down, and they still complained about that. We have all kinds of blessings, and sometimes we complain about those. But we see God is the same, but we choose to look at him, I would say, in a different way. But that's our choice. That's not what God's saying. God is always the same, just like his son. I'm the same yesterday, today, and forever. So here, he's given the Amorites an opportunity. And he says, verse 18, on that day the Lord made the covenant with Abram, to your offspring I give this land, from the river Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. So, and he keeps going, and he describes this land. Now he's already said, I'm giving the same promise. It's going to be passed down. Now he doesn't have anybody to pass it down to yet, but that's what the deal is. And so, as we go on, look at chapter 17. And so now, verse 4, behold, my covenant is with you. Now there's a covenant. And any time, and I've mentioned this before, anytime that you have a change of name, that means there's a change of relationship. So Abram, in verse 5, now I can say this. No longer your name will be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. There we go. You'll be the father of a multitude of nations. And so he's told him there's a nation promise talked about, and the whole aspect is you're going to be multiple nations. And he says in verse 6, I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make you into nations, and kings will come from you. Now, how would you feel if kings are going to come from your lineage? That'd be pretty good, wouldn't it? Queen Elizabeth got nothing on us then, huh? We'd be feeling pretty great. I mean, that's the way Abraham should have been feeling, like kings, because he's a sojourner. He's just a nomad. But now kings, and kings have a territory. So they're, called the kingdom. So his lineage is gonna have kingdoms. I mean, that's amazing. And so then you see in verse 8, he says, I will give you and your offspring after you the land of your sojourning. So you're going to be walking all around here and never get this promise. But they're going to have it. They're going to get it. And it says, the land of Canaan, the everlasting possession, I will be there, and I will be their God. And so then we see that there's the covenant that's going to be made, and how that's going to be made and shown. But distinguishing between two peoples is the men here would end up being circumcised. So then in chapter 15, he changes Sarai's name to Sarah. And I said in chapter 15, I meant verse 15. So chapter 17, verse 15, he changes her name. Chapter 17, that same chapter, verse 19, he says, but Sarah, your wife, will bear a son. You will call his name Isaac. Now he's already got, now that's amazing, isn't it? That's very similar to some of the other things that we've seen, how, Jesus, all these different things. You'll call him Emmanuel, all these things. Well, he's already got a name picked out for him because the plan is set in motion. You cannot detour and get away from God's plan. If you do, we'll see what happens as the studies go on. But Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him. That means the nation, the land, and the blessing is going to go through him. Verse 21, he says, I will establish my covenant with Isaac. So he says it over and over again. And so now they don't have to worry about coming up with, oh man, what are we going to name our kid? Well, let's name him after you, Abraham. Nope. We're going to name him Isaac. It's already solved. There's going to be no bickering and fighting. Well, after about my side of the family, we should have somebody. Nope, my side. Isaac. There we go. So as he goes on, look in chapter 18, verse 18. Seeing that Abraham, and now what's taking place is, this is when, let's just get to it. Seeing that Abraham, let's start in verse 17. Maybe I won't keep repeating myself like a record. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely be great and a mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. So meaning, this is talking about Jesus. This is talking about that blessing that's going to be a blessing for everyone, is going to be Jesus. He hasn't named it yet, but that's going to be blessing all nations. And so he brings that up again. You have the nation blessing, and you have the blessing. So the promise of the nation, the promise of a blessing. And the reason why he's saying this is because this is about to destroy two areas and the surrounding cities, Sodom, Gomorrah, and the surrounding areas. And so that I just bring up because he mentions it once again. And so you keep seeing this over and over again. Why do you think God is having to tell him over and over again these things? There's no right or wrong. Just what do you think? Reassurance. I mean, what's he looking at every day? He's looking at this land that he doesn't own. Everybody else, all these other nations around him are in charge of it. He's just kind of going from place to place, migrating, as the grass goes, so he goes, and just moving around. And he still doesn't have a kid, and his wife's tried to come up with different things to, hey, let's try this. How about your servant? That hasn't worked. And so all these different things, it's not happening on probably his time frame. And he's having to be reassured, this is going to happen, but you're not going to see any of this. How would you feel about all those things? There's going to be some wonderful things take place in your life. I mean, in history, coming from you, these things are going to be wonderful. Matter of fact, presidents are going to be coming from your lineage. Presidents. This nation is going to change, and it is going to be called something different. It is going to be called something after you, because all your descendants are going to spread out of the whole land. And you're going to have all of this. And presidents are going to come from you. Wouldn't that be something? And wouldn't you want to say, okay, I want to see a little bit. Just give me a little bit of a sign, a little something. Because seeing that day after day, that could be a little discouraging. Especially when you have a wife saying, hey, why don't you try my maidservant? Why don't you try to circumvent some the other way? And he's listening to her and he goes ahead and does it. Boy, that was not smart. And so those things, those become problems. Those become issues. Now, look in chapter 22. He keeps getting reminded. And in 22, this is something you're going to see with people that God uses. When you're ready, this is what you say. In chapter 22, verse 1, God tested Abraham, and he calls out Abraham, and what is his reply? Here I am. That phrase means, I'm ready. I'm ready for whatever you want. You know what happened to Samuel? We remember when he was a little kid, and he was calling, he kept going to Eli saying, hey, what's going on here? He says, I didn't call you. It happens, and then later on he says, hey, God's calling you. And so he says, here I am, your servant. That's what you say when you're ready to do whatever. And so the question would be this morning, are you in your life able to say, here I am, use me? Whichever way, just use me. I know you're the great provider, and I know you're the keeper of promises. When you promise, I know you always deliver. So here I am at your disposal. I'm your servant. That's what we've got to be able to say, because that's what Abraham said. And it's amazing as he goes on, he says it multiple times. In verse 11, comes to him again. Well, in verse 11, the angel says, Abraham says, here I am. And what's interesting is he's trained his son too. Because in verse 7, going up a few verses, and Isaac said to his father, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He is always ready to serve. He's always ready. So he's saying, I'm here, but I'm here to do the Lord's work. I'm here for you, God. The angel calls, I'm here for you. I'm ready to do it. And we end up knowing that when this thing takes place, he ends up calling that place in verse 14. Or you tell me, what does he call that place in verse 14? The Lord will provide. He was supposed to kill his son, sacrificing. God tested him. The amazing thing we see in Hebrews 11 is that he figured, well, God could raise him from the dead. So he already figured out something that some people hadn't figured out in their lifetime, that Jesus really rose from the dead. Because he's saying he could raise my son from the dead. So there shouldn't be a problem with Jesus coming back from the dead. But he has that faith, and he says the Lord will provide. Now, can you imagine him going to that place on his route at different times as he's sojourning, and his son and all that, and every time they come up to there, they just kind of look at each other. You remember? Yeah, I remember. Our God, he always provides. Always. And that's a comfort for us. And he says in verse 16, you have not withheld your son, your only son. Who else didn't do that? Who else didn't withhold their son, their only son? Our God, our Father, right? And so that is amazing right there. And he goes on in verse 17, Abraham, I'm telling you this, I will surely bless you. I will surely multiply your offspring. there's the nation, as the stars of the heaven, as the sand on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gates of the enemies. If they're going to possess the gates of the enemies, that means the land. They got the land promise again. And then in verse 18, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. There's the promise of the blessing. There's the promise of Jesus. It's a quiet, faint echo right now. Jesus. Jesus. That's all that's going on right now. He doesn't even know what this is. You know, it talked about angels long to look into these things. They didn't know the plan. But God knows the plan, and He's reminding that you're going to be blessed. You're going to be blessed. Well, don't we have that same type of thing? If we're faithful to the end, we get a blessing. So that should be something that encourages us, because He's a keeper of promises. And if He promises that we're going to be blessed in the end, if we stay true and faithful, man, that should give us comfort and strength to continue to be faithful. Now, He says He does this, and then look over in chapter 24. The promise is now going to be passed. In 24, look at verse 7. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and the land of my kindred, who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I'll give this land, and He will send an angel before you, and you shall take a wife from there. So Abraham's now saying, hey, this was promised that it was going to come to you, as he's telling Isaac. But now, in, 26, go to 26. Now the Lord appears to Isaac. And in verse 4 of chapter 26, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heavens, and I will give your offspring to these lands. And in your offspring all nations of the earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So He has already said, Isaac, you've got the blessing, the promise of the land, the nation, and the blessing. So that has been passed on. Look in verse 24. In verse 24, that same chapter, it says, and the Lord appeared to him that same night and said, I am the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you, and I will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. So it's going to keep on moving along. And then we get to chapter 28. See, I'm moving this a lot faster than when my dad went over Genesis, aren't I? Man, we 28 chapters already in. All right. Yeah, y'all make sure you give him a hard time. All right. I can't say too much with my 2 Timothy study. So here we see Jacob. He had a dream, and in verse 12, chapter 28. Let's go to verse 4 of chapter 28, verse 4. May He give the blessing of Abraham to you and to your offspring with you, that you may take possession of the land of your sojourners, and that God gave to Abraham. So now we see that this is one of those things that Isaac is calling Jacob, saying, hey, I'm passing this down to you. Well, now we see a dream in verse 12. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on earth, and on the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give you and your offspring. There's the land. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. There's the nation. So you shall spread abroad to the west, to the east, to the north, to the south. And in you, your offspring, shall all the families of the earth be blessed. There's the blessing. And so now it's gone through 3 generations. And what's interesting is he calls him something in, as we move on, chapter 32. See, we're really moving, guys. Chapter 32. Verse 28. He gets a name change. In verse 28, Jacob becomes who? becomes Israel, doesn't he? And so, if Jacob becomes Israel, there's a name change, there's a change in relationship. But that is a two-way street. Just because God says there's a change, there's got to be a change on your part. He continues to be called Jacob, which is interesting. All the way through, he continues to be Jacob the next few chapters. And I think maybe is because when we get to chapter 35, this may be the reason. God said to Jacob, chapter 35, verse 1, God said to Jacob, arise and go to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you, the one we just read about, when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods that are among you and purify yourselves and change your garments. So now it seems as though Jacob is now living up to his name because he's putting away foreign gods. He's now saying there's going to be just one God. And so now God, in verse 10, God tells him again, and God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. And I think it's because he's finally shucked off all the world, and he's told all of his family, we're not going to worship these foreign gods. We're purifying ourselves. We're going to make ourselves right and ready for God's use. So the challenge for us is, are you ready to make yourself useful for God? He's given you a name, a new name, just like he gave them. Your name is Christian. And so shall we live up to that name this week? Thank you.